Now Yakub, as we all know, is the father of all white people. He is the Mayo Master, the Cracker Commander, the Albinoid Allfather, who grafted a new race into existence to dominate the world for 6,000 years with the power of technology. But, have you ever stopped to consider who Yakub's father is? Now, if you watched my Yakub video, you might remember the name Wallace Fard Muhammad, the founder of the Nation of Islam and the originator of the oldest known Yakubian mythos. Now, I have a confession to make. In my original Yakub video, I failed to mention that the story there was sort of an amalgamation of a few different Yakub stories, and I completely omitted the second half of the story from my source, where a good version of Yakub, the Jesus is to Yakub's Satan if you will, this coochie-headed scientist named Yashmal, will appear and undo Yakub's work and bring down the tyranny of the Albinoid technologist world order through the power of his new doctrine, Teachnology, which may or may not be wokeness. Also, all the history I mentioned involving the aliens and the Hollow Earth, the Shiuk and the Sinine and Yakub's alien parentage were not Fard's work at all, but rather being added and taught later by a man named Malachi or Dwight York, another black supremacist. It's a bit of a black supremacist fanfiction going on here, and York is a whole insane rabbit hole unto himself. Trust me, it's nuts. But this is not a Malachi Z. York video, and today, we're only concerned with Mr. W.F. Muhammad, as I found his own existence and life story is just as fascinating as his big-headed white boy crafting evil scientist mythos, and the man himself is like a shape-shifting ghost in the records of history, appearing and vanishing across records, where he then gave rise to the largest black separatist religious movement in American history, and then vanished completely. It's a really fascinating story, and like all human beings, the story starts at birth. Wallace Fard Muhammad was born in... well, it's unclear exactly where he was born. Anywhere from Mecca to New Zealand to Afghanistan to Pakistan are all theorized to be potential origin points for Yakub's father. Fard himself in NOI tradition claimed that Fard was from Mecca, Saudi Arabia, giving him deep ties to the holy city, a fact that he exploited to teach a new syncretic version of Islam to his black followers. However, this claim is disputed, as there's no solid evidence as to a one Wallace Fard Muhammad ever being born or living near Mecca, and several documents such as census records, marriage certificates, prison records, and even some news articles that may include references to Fard seem to tell a different story. And it also doesn't help that Fard was a big fan of aliases, and it's estimated that he may have used up to 58 annoyingly similar sounding names in his life, which I'll go over after I tell his known story. But for now, let's head to the year 1930. 1930 is a very important year for Fard, as 1930 through 1934 are the only years in which we can confirm where exactly Fard was and what he was doing. After spending most of his life as a mysterious nameless entity, Fard surfaced in Detroit, Michigan in 1930, where he was first encountered as a door-to-door salesman, selling some curious silks to Detroit's black populations, many of which had only recently arrived there following the Great Migration, where many black families left the southern states between 1910 and 1970, fleeing the brutal Jim Crow-era law-enforced racism and segregation, endless threats of violence from lynch mobs in the KKK, and a lack of economic opportunity in the South, in hopes of a brighter future for themselves and their families in the hopefully less racist and richer North, only to usually find that the residents there wanted less than nothing to do with them, and the opportunities were not much better there either, upgrading from disrespected, underpaid, and oftentimes just straight up unpaid field workers, to disrespected, underpaid factory workers. And that's if the factory even hired black people at the time. It also didn't help that the nation was in the throes of the Great Depression, making any potential money even thinner. During this time, Fard would go door to door, selling Islamic silks to the residents, saying that he himself was a traveler from Mecca, and he would claim that these silks were the same kind that their ancestors used. Meccan ancestors, huh? This was the first step. Now obviously, black Americans are the descendants of African slaves, and their true family history had been long since stamped out and forgotten. But if the families wanted to learn more about this Meccan connection, Fard would offer to come back to teach them more and encourage them to tell all their friends and family about these teachings, and they would gather in their homes to hear what this fella had to say. And Fard himself seemed to have a very powerful aura to him. He was well groomed and well dressed in a sleek tailored suit and fez. He spoke with a unique eloquence, and he seemed more like a fashion model or a foreign dignitary rather than a humble salesman. And he seemed to have vast knowledge of history and religion, and this aura allowed him to convince many people to hear him out. Fard's initial study sessions began as humble gatherings in the homes of the people he was selling silks to, where despite the clear Islamic slant to himself and his beliefs, Fard would use the Bible, not the Quran, to preach and back up his teachings, as most of the black families that he preached to were only familiar with the Bible, and it seemed that Fard knew his shit, as his congregation only grew from there. And as it did, Fard began to switch up his rhetoric, and began denouncing white people openly, attacking the teachings of the Bible, calling it the poison book, and saying that it was the book of the Yakubian white demons, to rile up his supporters to near emotional crisis, preparing them to accept his new teachings more willingly. Fard began teaching a pretty radical form of black exceptionalism and nationalism, a pretty stark contrast from the country's current feelings on race. And this is the 1930s we're talking about. We're in the middle of the era of ascended racism. The Nazis had yet to fully make their rise, and scientific racism and eugenics were pretty popular ideas, even in America. I'm talking about actual skull measuring, forcefully sterilizing people deemed undesirable to have children, and categorizing humans into sub-races with defined ceilings and floors for intelligence and genetically predisposed behavior. Literal, I depicted myself as the Chad Wojak and you as the Lumpy Soyjak memes that you see 15-year-olds spam on X, but it's all completely genuine. Preaching using both the Bible and Quran, and even quoting passages by early Jehovah's Witnesses, notably the book Deliverance by Judge Franklin Rutherford when making his speeches. There are a ton of various unique beliefs and practices he preached, but in broad strokes, Fard presented himself as the Mahdi, the Islamic herald of the end times, and the man who would rule the world in the name of Islam and justice. And despite his white appearance, he claimed to be an Asiatic black man, and was born with white features as to better hide and mingle amongst the white albinoid children of Yakub, and move unseen. Fard taught his followers that white people were the true racial inferiors, on account of their lack of inner divinity and empathy, and the fact that they were the byproduct of an evil science project, grafted from the original black human race by our father Yakub, and said that black people need to separate themselves completely from these pale demons. He advocated that African Americans start their own businesses, raise families, eat healthy foods like no meat besides fish, and to avoid drugs and alcohol, which is all generally pretty good advice if you ask me. He was teaching his followers to lead responsible, hardworking, and healthy lives, despite the giga-brained baby-killing scientist lore holding it all together. Fard also taught his followers that all black peoples were Muslim, and that they had to reject their white slave owner names like Smith, or Richardson, or Johnson. And instead, they would be given new Muslim names, or he would bestow upon them the X in their name, which stands for the unknown, himself even taking the name Wallace Fard Muhammad sometime later, a practice that's pretty synonymous with the NOI, and made famous by guys like Cassius Clay changing his name to Muhammad Ali, or Malcolm X's change from Malcolm Little to El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, and so on. Now this wasn't a new practice though, and giving new names to followers was done before, most notably by the Moorish Science Temple of America, another black nationalist church that predated the NOI, which is a whole nother story unto itself. This is not a Moorish Science Temple of America video. And this practice of giving new names, along with other similarities between Fard's teachings and the MSTs, like both saying that black peoples were Asiatic specifically, as both believed black people to be the original race of man, originating from the Middle East, which they considered to be a part of Asia. And therefore, whites were the true colored peoples, and both temples claimed descent from some lost black Middle Eastern empire of some kind, leading many to believe that Fard was a former member of the Moorish Science Temple, and took strong inspiration and ideas from his time there to craft his mythos. Some even claim that he was indeed a part of the MST, going by the name David Ford L., and he tried to grab power in the temple by claiming to be the reincarnation of the temple's recently deceased founder, a man named Noble Drew Ali, which if this story is true, it didn't seem to work. And from there, Fard continued to grow his congregation, gaining so many new followers from his humble house lessons that he eventually had to teach in shifts. And later his followers pooled their resources, and they were able to rent a Detroit speaking hall to serve as their first temple, even meeting and converting his successor, a man named Elijah Poole, later Elijah Muhammad, the actual most important man in NOI history, which is also another story. He's the man who would expand the NOI to the nationwide organization it would later become. Fard also mostly ditched the Bible in favor of the Quran for his teachings, and his teachings really began to solidify. Now the original, Fard-approved NOI mythology doesn't have ballsack-headed immortal aliens living in the hollow earth, but it's still one hell of a tale regardless, and it all starts with Allah. In the beginning, there was nothing. And then Allah formed himself out of nothing, taking the form of a black man after 6 trillion years of grinding and hard work. He then created 24 imams, 24 god scientists who would rule as the god of the universe in cycles. That was, until one of the god scientist imams went rogue. Now I'm not sure about the exact continuity here, but one story claims that the original human race all lived on the moon, but the moon was destroyed after a, quote, black god scientist got pretty ass mad that all the moon-dwelling peoples didn't all speak the same language. So naturally, he blew up the entire moon with explosives, with one of the fragments of the blown up moon becoming Earth, where the original 13 tribes of man later emerged. Other versions say that Earth itself was blown up by the planet-destroying terrorist scientist man with dynamite, which exploded so powerfully, a chunk of the Earth got blown off and eventually formed the moon. And then the 13 Arabic-speaking tribes of man that existed on the Earth at the time were all wiped out by this planet-sized bomb. I'm just not sure if the moon blew up and created the Earth, or vice versa. But regardless, all of the tribes were wiped out, except for one, led by a scientist named Shabazz, who had led his tribe of followers from their original home of Mecca, Saudi Arabia, to the unoccupied lands of what we call Africa today. And Shabazz wanted to move his people to this harsher and untamed land because he, quote, wanted the people to undergo a form of life that would make them tough and hard, which transformed them from their original form of a dark-skinned, yet soft and straight-haired people, to how modern people of African descent look today, developing their stiff, afro-textured hair from their time in the harsh jungles of Africa. And surviving the planet-sized dynamite bombing and subsequent cataclysm was just an added bonus for this migration. Once Shabazz's people were nice and hardened, they returned to Mecca and established their dominion, where Yakub was soon born near the city's outskirts, where he then mostly follows the story I outlined in my first video, getting the idea to make white people while fucking around with magnets, took his 59,999 technology followers to Patmos, and created the white race from there using his despotic eugenics regime, who then took over the planet and ruled it for 6,000 years with their tricknologist powers after living in some caves for a while, eventually enslaving the descendants of Shabazz's tribe, stealing them away from their homeland of Mecca to Europe and later America, where their true identities, language, history, and religion were all brutally suppressed and taken from their memory, lost to history through centuries of horrific slavery and exploitation. But never fear, W.D. Fard is here, and he is Allah's only true and honest prophet. Fard himself claiming to descend from the same familial Arabic tribe as the Prophet Muhammad. I mean, he knows the weight and size of the earth, and its square mileage off the top of his head. That's proof enough that he's the Mahdi. And he's here to reveal this lost history and religion to his followers, who will rise up, obliterate the white demons after 6,000 years of world rule, purge mankind of its evil completely, and reestablish their nation of Islam all in accordance with Allah's will. And it worked. Many of his followers came to believe that Fard himself was an avatar of Allah, blessed with encyclopedic knowledge of history and religion, and his mysterious past and his reclusive personality just helped to boost his aura and mystique amongst his followers. Fard's following continued to grow rapidly, reaching 8,000 members pretty quickly, and it seemed our plucky prophet was on his way to huge religious success, until he ran into a bit of a snag. On November 20th, 1932, a man named Robert Harris, who had been dubbed Robert Kareem by Fard after joining his flock, escorted a man named James J. Smith into a room with a makeshift altar, James Smith thinking that Harris was going to induct him into Fard's church, known at the time as the Allah Temple of Islam. This room also had a dozen witnesses, along with Harris's wife and children. Allegedly, Harris asked Smith if he would sacrifice his life for Islam, which he agreed to, and he then climbed into this sketchy-ass altar, and Harris claimed that his sacrifice would make him a savior of the world, and he then stabbed Smith in the heart, smashed his skull in with a car axle, and then stabbed him some more for good measure, covering the floor in Smith's blood. Just a real nice family bonding experience. Harris was then promptly arrested after neighbors called the cops on him for ritualistically murdering someone in his apartment. And following his arrest, it was incredibly apparent that Robert Harris was a complete nutcase, calling himself King Kareem and saying that he, quote, had to kill somebody. I could not forsake my gods, while under questioning. And his wife claimed that he had an extensive history of mental illness and violent outbursts, saying that he had threatened to decapitate her and their children several times, even forcing her to witness the sacrifice by beating her until she complied. He also had plans to murder 3 other people, 2 judges and a social worker. And this plan to kill 4 people seemed to be a misinterpretation of a passage in one of Fard's books, The Secret Rituals of the Lost Foundation of Islam, where he mentions that, quote, every son of Islam must gain a victory from the devil. 4 victories and the son will attain his reward. Harris seemingly thinking that these victories meant to murder people he didn't like, as the social worker had recently terminated his benefit payments. Robert Harris will later be deemed insane and committed to an insane asylum after a crazy trial, where some highlights include Harris entering the court wearing a fez, and when ordered to take it off, he refused and said he was king of the courtroom. So the bailiffs tried taking it off of him, but he just put it back on, and this went back and forth until the bailiffs just gave up and let him wear the fez. And during his testimony, he said that he had killed Smith because it was, quote, crucifixion time. And once he was done testifying, Harris looked the judge dead in the eye, and he said, well,
I have to go now.
And he tried to walk out of the courtroom, but he was restrained by the police. And while he was being subdued, he shouted that he was the king here and everywhere. What the hell? But despite the fact that Harris was a complete basket case, was not a notable member of the ATOI with any sort of power in the organization, nor did the temple have any known beliefs or rituals involving practicing human sacrifice, the local news went wild with the story, claiming that Harris was a, quote, high priest or, quote, voodoo chieftain of a voodoo cult, and that there were hundreds of people who supported Harris's murderous actions. And this story and the following public outrage put a huge target on Fard's back, the papers painting the entire Allah Temple of Islam as some Lovecraftian murder cult with insane minorities, who were slaying people in the name of, quote, Islamic jungle gods. They're really hamming up those stereotypes to make the articles pop. And Fard would be arrested by the Detroit police and had his temple raided, even being thrown into a padded cell after explaining his religion and his role as Mahdi, straight jacket and all. But he vehemently denied claims of teaching human sacrifice. And after 5 days of detainment, Elijah Muhammad even led a protest crowd to the court to demand an immediate end to their leader's extended unjustified detainment, which was ultimately unsuccessful. And Fard wouldn't be released until around 18 days later, where the police held him and his chief aide, a one Mr. Ugan Ali, until they could reach a deal with them. In exchange for his release, Fard and Ali were to disband the Allah Temple of Islam, and Fard was to leave Detroit and never return. I didn't know that permanent exile from a city was a legal punishment back in the 30s. The Allah Temple of Islam would be disbanded, but it would be quickly reformed into the beginning of the Nation of Islam as we know it today. And Ugan Ali was ultimately replaced by Elijah Muhammad to run this spiritual successor. Fard himself was put on a train headed for Chicago, where Detroit police hoped he would fuck off for good. But Fard wasn't done just yet. Fard would sneak back into Detroit at least 3 times following his police-enforced exile, once to meet with his followers in secret, allegedly telling them that the end times were coming, a second time just to preach out on the street corner to anyone who'd listen, which unsurprisingly got him arrested by the cops because he was still banned from the entire city. So he was booked, had his mugshot taken, and was booted out of the city again. But before his final visit to Detroit, Fard seemingly couldn't help himself. He had a real need for preach, and put up posters encouraging local African Americans to come listen to him preach in a Chicago speaking hall. And he was arrested for disorderly conduct and disturbing the peace with his Yakubian devil speeches, but his charges were ultimately dropped. It's not illegal to give a public speech. And this Chicago arrest booking being the last verifiable location Fard was ever recorded in. Fard's third and final visit to Detroit is a bit more nebulous, but apparently, he claimed that these white demons would soon be destroyed by the Mother Plane, a magical planet-sized plane that was built in Japan that would release smaller planes that would drop poisonous bombs all over America, killing all of Yakub's offspring and only sparing 144,000 black Muslims. It's kind of like Red Skull's plan to bomb America using mini planes launched from one big superplane in Captain America. A superweapon made in Japan being a pretty large part of Fard's mythos, as Fard was a huge supporter of Japan and its empire. He was sort of like a proto-weeaboo, as he saw Japan as the Asiatic champion of all people against the Yakubian devil armies of the United States, England, and so on. So Fard must have been pretty devastated to see them ally with one of the most powerful and dastardly Yakubians to ever live later on, if he was even still alive by then. But these bombs for the Mother Plane would penetrate a mile into the ground, and would then crack open the earth in a 50 square mile radius after exploding, and any survivors would be choked out by the poisonous gas or mopped up by NOI goons. So essentially, Fard's predicted endgame was an apocalyptic race war between all black Muslims and all white people, with support from a Japanese UFO wonder weapon with planet-busting poisonous bombs. It kind of feels like the plot to a Black Ops 3 Zombies map. And with helter-skelter Japanese UFO poison bomb Armageddon coming soon, Fard wished to make some pretty sweeping reforms to the cult's structure and operations, including founding the Fruit of Islam, a sort of paramilitary group of the cult where male members will be drilled and trained like soldiers, and were taught some karate for some self-defense and discipline, and created homemaking and cooking classes for female members, as the NOI advocates for highly conservative gender roles, where women are meant to mostly be only homemakers and wives. He also established the University of Islam, an alternative to the Detroit school system where parents could enroll their kids in NOI-approved schooling, but these were less official schools and more just makeshift lessons taught right in the temple halls. Now this seemed like a pretty solid plan to cement the structure and survival of the newly refounded NOI, but Fard was wildly overstepping when establishing his alternative Yakubian school, as many local Detroit school officials became pretty suspicious when a large amount of kids with known temple connections just stopped showing up to school, which eventually led police to find out about the University of Islam, revealing that the ATI was still around and had lots of followers, just operating under different names and signage. And this bust would kick up another public shitstorm against the NOI, with local papers declaring that the quote, voodoo cult was back and ready to kill, and the schools were raided, and Elijah Muhammad was arrested for running an illegal school, but was released on a 6-month probation charge. And this court case was also pretty wild too, like the Harris one, as apparently, a female student who was detained during a raid on one of the University of Islam locations testified she was taught that if she were to decapitate 4 Yakubian devils, she would win a free trip to Mecca like it's Islamic The Price is Right or something, along with a button with a picture of fart on it, which is kind of a shitty reward for killing 4 people, but whatever. She also said that all white people will be killed off by 1934 due to fighting and poisonous gas, and this wacky sensational testimony put even more pressure than ever on Fard and Elijah, with the latter eventually fleeing to Chicago to reestablish the NOI there, as Elijah Muhammad was under the impression that the Detroit police were getting real sick of all this black Muslim nonsense, and they wanted him and Wallace Fard Muhammad dead. Whereas for Fard himself, he just sort of vanished and was never seen again by any of his Detroit followers. Elijah Muhammad consolidated his power and reestablished the NOI in Chicago and made it official in late 1934, claiming that the Muhammad from the Quran was just a fan, and Elijah was the true Prophet Muhammad, and he continued to deify Fard and NOI canon as the years went on, where current NOI doctrine claims that Fard had boarded the mother plane itself, and is out there in the cosmos doing shit only Allah can do, like visiting with the green men from Zarbadan 5 or something. And one day, Fard will return to bomb the Yakubian fiends into extinction and finally save the world. Elijah also claimed to be in contact with Fard for some time after his disappearance, and claimed they had gotten a letter from him at the Mexican border, but it's unclear how long their correspondence lasted, if it even lasted at all. But from here, Fard disappears into the cracks of history, and it's a total mystery where he went, whether he returned to Mecca like he claimed he would, went to Europe, got deported, or just hid away somewhere in America. We don't even know if he died naturally or was even possibly murdered, maybe by the police or government officials or by other NOI members. But by 2024, he'd be well over 100 years old by now, like around 140 years old or something. So it's safe to say he's been dead a long time. But that begs the question,
who the hell is this guy?
Well, for starters, we only have around 10 or so pictures of the man. A few mugshots, pictures of him showing the police a book, his official NOI portrait, a few other pictures, and that's pretty much it. And even these pictures aren't always reliable, as it seems that Fard's official portrait, the most commonly used photo of him, seems to have been doctored from a different, similar photo. And here's the two compared. It seems that Fard's features were squashed to make his head look rounder, and his mouth has been curled into a frown. And the book he's reading has been changed from whatever he was holding, likely a copy of Deliverance, to a thick copy of the Quran. Weird. And from these photos, as you can see, he is clearly not African American, and was described most often as Caucasian or some sort of Arabic, maybe even Pakistani. And here's where we can get into some old records. The earliest potential records we have of Fard comes from newspapers based in the Eugene to Salem area of Oregon dating from 1908. There are 2 potential identities that could be Fard. A one Fred Waldad, also known locally as Fred the Turk or Fred the Greek, a Eugene-based tamale vendor that we know of through some mentions of him in the local Eugene newspapers, chronicling his various exciting exploits, like getting ordered to move his tamale cart, and then having to abandon it to sell tamales out of the back of his cigar shop, and paying licensing fees to open up a new tamale stand in a new location, and other such bombshells like the news that Fred the Turk was going to travel to Portland for a bit. Damn. These early 1900s Oregonians must have been bored as fuck if the local tamale salesman taking a trip was paper-worthy news. But Fred Waldad here disappears from the record in early 1909, with the news reporting that he sold his tamale cart and moved to Cottage Grove, Oregon. Later in the year, though, a suspiciously similarly named man, a one Wally Fred Dad, listed his occupation as a restaurateur based in Eugene, and he applied for citizenship, claiming to be a Caucasian from Hong Kong. So it's possible that Fred Waldad and Wally Fred Dad were the same person. It's pretty much the same name too, just rearranged. The other potential identity is that of Fred Dodd, another tamale vendor, this time from Salem, Oregon, who we also know about from some other seemingly inconsequential newspaper appearances, like a story about him attending his first baseball game, and a spat with the local authorities over whether or not he can sell fruit without an extra license. Riveting stuff, I know. And in 1914, Dodd was arrested for, quote, assaulting a married woman, but it seems that he just banged a woman who happened to be married, and the charges were soon dropped. Dodd then married a 17-year-old named Pearl Allen in May 1914, but they divorced by the end of the year, so she probably never knew about his later exploits as the Yakubian prophet. And Fred Dodd's last mention occurs in late 1915, where the local Salem papers claim that Fred Dodd was going on a vacation to San Francisco, LA, and then on to San Diego. And again, this is news? And the papers described him as, quote, the genial Turkish lad. This matching up with the description for Waldad of a Turkish/Ottoman looking dude who worked in food service and liked to take trips apparently. But it seems this trip was a bit more permanent than the papers expected, and Fred Dodd is not mentioned again after his travel announcement. Rather, a Wally Dodd Ford crops up in Los Angeles, who claims that he is a restaurateur, perhaps of the tamale kind, and claimed that he was an Afghani citizen living in the USA, this coming from a 1917 draft registration card from our guy. He also got arrested for assault with a deadly weapon that same year, but he didn't serve significant jail time for this arrest. Well, that's fun. Ford doesn't resurface again until 1920, where according to the 1920 census, he had gotten married to a one Hazel Ford, seemingly between 1917 and 1920, reporting that he was a white man from New Zealand. Later in 1924, it seems that Ford and Hazel couldn't keep it together, and Ford remarried a woman named Carmen Trevino, and this is marriage number 3 for those counting at home. And Ford makes the bizarre claim that his parents were named Zara Dodd and Babji Ford, and were from Madrid, Spain on their marriage certificate. And these names sound so fake, it just seems like Ford trying to see what he can get away with on these documents. But Ford couldn't steer clear of trouble with the fuzz, and was arrested for drug possession in 1926, which landed him around 3 years in the can at San Quentin prison, and he wasn't paroled until 1929, with 2 of Ford's mugshots coming from this arrest and his time in the prison. And Ford seemingly disappeared from the LA record after his release from San Quentin, where it's very possible that he had skipped town and moved to Detroit, dropped Wally Dodd Ford for the new moniker of Wallace D. Fard, usually shortened to W.D. Fard, and he began his silk salesman job until he established his church and went through the entire saga I just mentioned, before vanishing after being driven from Detroit a 3rd time, where he then becomes a total ghost, with only speculation and Elijah Muhammad's word on his whereabouts to go on. And that was until around 1957, when the FBI decided to officially investigate and try to ascertain the true identity of the Nation of Islam's prophet and founder Wallace Fard Muhammad, his origins, his whereabouts and/or fate, and identify any living family members he may still have. But it seems the only family member that they could find was Hazel Barton Ford, the woman Wally Dodd Ford married in Los Angeles in 1920. The two did have a son, but he died in a car accident in 1942. Hazel gave a description of Wally D. Ford, saying that he was a white man from New Zealand, which matches previous descriptions. The FBI also found that fingerprints and pictures of Wallace Fard Muhammad's Detroit arrest in 1933 for illegally re-entering the city matched that of Wally Dodd Ford's when he was incarcerated in San Quentin prison. And while the photographs aren't totally one-to-one, they do look really similar. And the first arrest pic and the last do look like the same person, aged almost a decade between the two. And I can totally see this being Fard in both pictures. And if the fingerprints do indeed match, then I see that as pretty damning evidence that Wally Dodd Ford and Wallace Fard Muhammad are the same person, although it seems that these fingerprint claims were never legally proved. However, this claim is completely refuted by the NOI themselves, who reject the idea that Wally D. Ford and Wallace Fard Muhammad are the same person, saying that the FBI had forged the fingerprints to make the connection between the two. Elijah Muhammad even offered a $100,000 bounty to anyone who could prove that their prophet was the same man arrested for drug possession in LA. As if the FBI's claims were true, Fard would be known to the public as a white boy with a rap sheet, which would not be great for his image as the avatar of capital A Allah himself. Also, the FBI allegedly fed a bullshit story about Fard to black newspapers in an attempt to discredit him, saying that Fard was, quote, a Turkish-born Nazi agent who worked for Hitler in World War II, assuming that Hitler had schemed up a plan for a man to sow racial chaos in Detroit by preaching the Yakubian story, somehow, almost a decade before World War II even started. And they also claimed that Fard had met Elijah Muhammad in prison, and that the whole Nation of Islam was just a racket, schemed up by the two to make money off of impressionable black families by charging them to become Muslim. But fake news and bounties aside, the FBI ultimately failed to determine Fard's identity, as they couldn't find any immigration records that may have belonged to Fard, and the case on him was officially closed in 1958, the FBI concluding that he originated from Oregon, and that's pretty much where we're still at today. Wallace Fard Muhammad's origin, true identity, and fate all remain unknown, leaving us only with speculation, newspaper clippings, and official NOI claims to go off of. And some authors have posited their own theories as to his origin. Carl Evans theorizes that Fard was likely a Pakistani Muslim man, as Fard is a common Pakistani surname, and many of the names given to his followers, such as Shabazz, of Ghulam and Khalat are all Pakistani names, and many of his followers, including Malcolm X's nephew and brother, described Fard as having Pakistani features. And he also allegedly had a real hate boner for Hinduism, teaching Elijah Muhammad that God let Hindus go astray and worship whatever gods they wanted, and now they have so many heathen gods they can't even remember them all, which makes sense if he was Pakistani. It's kind of like this image over there. And others claim that he may have been an Ottoman Greek man, as the current NOI flag is identical to that of the flag of the Ottoman Empire. Oregon and the Pacific Northwest were popular locations for Greek immigrants, and Yakub took his followers and established his cracker empire on Patmos, an island he'd be very familiar with if he was from Greece. And his immigration to Oregon could line up with the Greco-Turkish War of 1897, as he may have immigrated around that time and established himself as a humble tamale vendor by 1908. But this is all just educated speculation. And as for me, I believe that he was raised as a Muslim, likely a Shia Muslim, and was most likely not from America, on account of his various aliases and lack of immediate family such as parents, siblings, aunts or uncles to be found in the United States, as I feel like an immediate family member would have turned up if he was born and raised in the USA. Like the FBI would have been able to find an uncle or a brother or something, leading me to believe that he emigrated alone from whatever nation he had originated from, likely somewhere within the Ottoman Empire. And after a while, he became convinced that white people were the devil, possibly through his repeated incarcerations or through witnessing the racism of early 1900s America, and had to spread the gospel to warn of the evils of our big-brained father Yakub's technologist world order. And as for his fate, I find it's most likely that Fard either died or was deported or simply just left the USA, which I feel is backed up by his actions during his Detroit exile, as he had a real powerful urge to preach his Yakubian doctrine, risking arrest multiple times just to get the word out. So if he remained in the US following 1934, I feel like he would have popped up somewhere giving a Yakubian speech in a rented hall. But overall, I personally believe that, at the minimum of what we know, Wally Dodd Ford and Wallace Fard Muhammad are indeed the same person. It just lines up too well in both description and timeline, and it does indeed look like the same guy in both pictures. But we will never truly know. The records are just too fragmented and too old. And unless Farrakhan has Fard's body preserved in some kind of NOI cryogenic freezer, it seems that Fard had quite literally fallen off the face of the earth, never to be found again. Ever. He might as well have boarded the mother plane. It's really fascinating. And people can't just really up and vanish like this anymore, especially ones with so much power and notoriety as Fard had. And I hope you found this story to be just as interesting as I did. But that's all I got for you today. Metro Exodus is next, and I love you all. Goodbye.